Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of National Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleagues in this House who have spoken to this bill. As the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Heritage, I'm very proud to rise today to speak in support of Bill C-391. I want to begin by sincerely thanking the Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester for bringing this very important issue before Parliament. I'd also like to thank him for being so open and about the prospect of amendments to this bill. That and the comments so far by other honourable members of this House from different parties show that we are all here to work together. We believe that the government has an important leadership role to play in support of repatriation of Indigenous cultural property, which is so critical to our work overall to promote reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, we're supporting this bill because it's a critical step in the right direction, in the direction of empowering Indigenous persons, in the direction of ensuring a renewed relationship with all Indigenous persons, First Nations, Inuit and Métis people, in the direction of respect and, most importantly, in the direction of autonomy. A new national strategy on the repatriation of Indigenous cultural property is something I've heard about locally by advocates for reconciliation in my riding of Parkdale High Park, but it's also something we've heard about nationally when consulting with Indigenous leaders, literally from coast to coast to coast. This is an idea whose time has clearly arrived, but we also believe that there are a number of ways in which this bill can and should be strengthened. And I take some comment there and pause to reflect upon the comments made by members of the two opposition parties that have just spoken on this bill today. So the government will indeed be seeking some amendments to this bill. First, we have heard others refer to the importance of repatriation of Indigenous human remains. Indeed, the comments by the member opposite just prior to my comments now. Indigenous communities themselves have shown that this is often the highest priority for them. It seems that some consider human remains to be part of what the bill calls, quote, Aboriginal cultural property, but that aspect is not clear. We feel that the bill should be explicit in stating that the proposed national strategy focus on both cultural property and human remains. Second, Mr. Speaker, we've also heard other honourable members voice concern over the definition of Aboriginal cultural property in the bill. Definitions are always tricky, Mr. Speaker. We know that as parliamentarians. We don't believe that this term should actually be defined in the legislation itself. It doesn't appear to be defined elsewhere in law, and it's not even defined in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It would be much more appropriate, in our view, if the scope of the strategy and any necessary definitions were developed as part of the strategy itself, in cooperation with Indigenous communities and the holders of collections. We shouldn't define the term in legislation itself because we may end up with something either too vague or too narrow, and we may inadvertently exclude something that we may regret after the fact. Third, and to the same point, Mr. Speaker, the bill refers to cultural property where there is a strong attachment. Who or how should this strong attachment be judged? In our view, this concept and the scope of the proposed mechanism is best left to be determined in consultation with all stakeholders during the development of the strategy that Bill 391 contemplates. The point is that we need to be very careful that the bill doesn't go too far into determining the details of the strategy in advance. To do so would restrict the ability of the government and all those that work with it, most importantly Indigenous persons themselves, to come up with the best possible result. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, speaking of the development of the national strategy in cooperation with stakeholders, Bill C-391 makes reference to the role to be played by the provinces, but there's no mention of the territories, and that certainly is something that should be added. One of the really innovative aspects of the bill is that it proposes the creation of a forum for the resolution of conflicting claims. Mr. Speaker, we're assuming that this is meant to be a forum where, if more than one Indigenous community or organization is claiming the same item, Indigenous people will get together and decide whose claim should go forward. That's very, very important and should be highlighted. Sorting out something of this nature should not be the role of a museum facing competing claims, and it should not be the role of the government. It should be up to Indigenous people themselves. That's the point of reconciliation, Mr. Speaker. It's about ending the patterns and habits of colonialism where too often governments have told Indigenous persons about policies that affect them rather than working with Indigenous persons to co-develop those policies in a respectful nation-to-nation or Inuit Crown or government-to-government relationship in the context of the Métis. Co-development is the method we are pursuing with tabling Canada's first ever Indigenous Languages Act, a project I've been privileged to work on as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Heritage. And that spirit of moving away from the old colonial ways of thinking to ensure that decisions to decide between competing claims to potentially the same Indigenous item rest with Indigenous people is something that needs to be emphasized more clearly in this bill. It also shouldn't be a forum where the government adjudicates claims between Indigenous communities and the holders of collections. I cannot stress enough that success in repatriation depends on direct dialogue between Indigenous peoples and institutions. The government shouldn't be trying to insert itself in the middle of that dialogue, but clearly has a role to play in facilitating that dialogue. It's also important to acknowledge that a single forum may not be appropriate. Separate forums may be needed for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We need to take what we call a distinctions-based approach and acknowledge the unique circumstances of each of these three groups. There are two more amendments that I would like to raise, Mr. Speaker. Cinquième, compte tenu de tout de ce que nous avons.
Fifth, given everything we have to do and everything that has been said here, it is clear that developing a national strategy will be neither easy nor simple. 2 years is not enough time to do the work required. We have to consult and be advised. The minister, if the minister is forced to present a strategy within 2 years, that may not be enough time. We want that the period of development of the strategy be extended to 3 years. And I do believe with the honourable member that a deadline is necessary to focus the consultations.
My sixth point relates to the report that the minister will provide after the first 2 years of the strategy's implementation. As the bill is drafted, the section on the report seems to suggest that success can only be measured in the number of objects that are actually returned. Mr. Speaker, in this chamber and as parliamentarians, we know that that is not the only form that positive outcomes to negotiations may take. We also know that there will be some information, particularly on negotiations still underway, which will simply be too sensitive to be included in a report that becomes public. So some adjustment on how the report is described is needed in our view. We fully support the need for a report and the accountability and transparency that it will bring with respect to delivering on the national strategy. Mr. Speaker, none of the potential amendments that I've mentioned will weaken Bill C-391 or change its fundamental objective of enabling more progress on repatriation, the honourable goal of the member from Cumberland-Colchester. We support what he is working to do here. We want that progress to take place, and that's why our party and our government is supporting this bill. We look forward to working on amendments that will increase the chance of successfully implementing a national strategy for the repatriation of Indigenous cultural property. Thank you.